Happy Sunday, everybody. Welcome back to Tim Travels. It's your host, Terry. So I'm coming to you from the parking lot at Sheetz in Willoughby, Ohio. Had a load that delivered yesterday down in Streetsboro. They didn't have an empty for me, so I kind of been bobtailing around. And I got to run down to Wintersville to get an empty according to dispatch. So we'll see how that works out, because the last time I had a drop and hook in Wintersville at the Walmart, they didn't have any empties. So I got a load picking up tomorrow in Hiram, Ohio, and that's going to Lewiston, Maine, to the Walmart there. And then I'm going to be taking a little bit of time off and camping in Maine with my esposa and at Acadia National Park. So I'm looking forward to that, because that's a national park I've never been to. So man, action-packed show today. Action-packed show. So I'm gonna mix it up a little bit. I'm gonna do some trucking stuff right up front here, and then on the back end, I'm gonna do a historical report, and it's a big treat. So I hope you'll stick around for that. You won't be disappointed. So anyway, just let me give a shout out. I mean, there's a lot of things I don't care for in Ohio, but let me say this. I've always liked the Cleveland area. I used to come up here for business all the time. I got friends in the legal community here. I think Cleveland's a great town, by the way. Notwithstanding that those guys over at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, like received stolen property, and they need to give that stuff back to Don Henley, that his notes from writing Hotel California and stuff. And I don't know if you heard about that, but some people have been like indicted for it. Anyway, so there's a lot of stuff to do up here in this part of the world. There's a lot of historic sites. Of course, Cleveland's a big town. They got 3 major sports franchises. There's museums, there's culture, there's history. And also, one of the best kept secrets, I think, among national parks is the Cuyahoga National Park, which basically is in the Cuyahoga River Valley. Now, that's the river that empties out into the into Lake Erie up in Cleveland. And that's the famous river that caught on fire. It really, you spill fuel on any water and it gets a spark, it's going to go up. So I'm not saying the river is like super clean back then, but it's just anyway. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff to do, and I'm going to share some of that with you in a minute. But another thing that is interesting about Cleveland, and I always think about it when I come through here, I mentioned taking property law in law school the other day. And so stick with me for a second. So what happened is, a while back I talked about some local residents in New Braunfels, Texas, getting all butthurt about the fact that Love's wanted to build a truck stop. And their justification was, well, there are other truck stops, it's going to be right by our houses, blah, blah, blah. But of course, they bought in a subdivision that's right next to a major interstate, basically. I mean, it's set off a little bit, but it's off the frontage road, and Love's wants to build in front of them so you could see the Loves from the I'm trying to get rid of some of this. You could see the Loves, they want to build so you could see it from I-35. And by the way, if you've driven that I-35 corridor from, say, San Antonio to Dallas, you know that there are a lot of truck stops, but there's also a need for a lot of truck parking. So anyway, let's transfer up to Montana, in the area just west of Butte. And in Butte, I-90 and I-15 meet, right? 15's coming up from Idaho, 90's going across east-west, going across Montana. So there's this little town west of Butte, and it's actually west of the intersection where 15 comes up from the south and meets up with 90. So it's west of that intersection, in a little town called Ramsey. And when I say a little town, I mean a little town, like 40 houses. And Love's has gotten permitted to build a truck stop in Ramsey. Now, there are 2 truck stops to the east of where 15 comes in. There's a Flying J and a Pilot, but those are not actually company Flying J pilots. They are Pilot Flying J dealers. Okay, so they're not particularly huge, but in any event, they're on the other side of where the intersection is. And it really doesn't matter because we're talking about the free market, we're talking about land use. And here's why Cleveland comes into the discussion about land use. And it really isn't Cleveland, it's really a suburb of Cleveland called Euclid. And if you're familiar with the Cleveland area, you know Euclid is just to the east of Cleveland. And back in 1926, right, Cleveland's growing, cities are getting, in the industrial north, continuing to grow, but they're also expanding outward, right? The suburbs are starting to become a thing. Suburbs wouldn't really take off until, after World War II, but Euclid was a close-in suburb, right? So you might not, unless you knew where the border was, you might not have known, from one to the other. So anyway, in 1926, there was this realty company that owned a bunch of land, and I think they were called Amber Realty. And what happened was the village of Euclid passed some zoning ordinances about these different sections in the city. And remember, this is 1926, right? Euclid, the town, the village, passes these laws. The realty company's like, well, hey, you have basically taken away our property rights. And the realty company sues the village of Euclid based on a case that they say that under the 14th Amendment, they were not afforded due process, and that they were, I can't remember the other thing they pointed up, but it didn't seem, I read a brief of the case, it didn't seem, and by the way, I read this years ago in property law. That's because this is a seminal case. This is the seminal case on zoning in America. Maybe this and, Coastal Carolina Commission or whatever. But anyway, so what happens is that they win at the district court level, and there's an injunction that's issued. And what ends up happening is the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has a fairly deferential standard to local ordinances when it's just economic impact, right? And so, excuse me. So what happens is the Supreme Court basically says, hey, unless you can show some, huge violation of rights, other than just you can't use the property exactly how you want to, we're going to uphold zoning regulations passed by local governments. And this is the first case that kind of codified that. So this is, when you talk about zoning, you got to talk about Euclid. And what happened out in Ramsey was this. A planning board said, hey, there's no compelling reason for us to not grant the permits to Love's to build this truck stop. Well, these people that live in the little town of Ramsey, they're super, super pissed because they don't want a truck stop. Now, mind you, Ramsey is right beside I-90, and they have their own exit, right? Which is their death knell. They probably loved that exit when it was built there, when the highway was built, because Ramsey's been around for a while. It was, it's been around since I think around 1800, because there was mining there that supported the U.S. government, and then going back to World War I and stuff. So Ramsey's been there a while, but they got this exit, and this exit benefits them. And so Love's was like, well, hey, there's land zoned for this. We'd like to build a truck stop. And what happened is the permits were issued, so they went to the county council, And they basically wanted the county council to reverse the decision of the planning board. And really, though, the only issue was before the council was, did the planning board act correctly? Not the merits of the project, not, you know, any environmental impact. Simply, did they correctly issue the permits for this type of property on that land? And the council concluded that the planning board did do their job correctly. And the thing is, some of the council members were like, we hate this. We hate the fact that Love's is going to build this truck stop. It's just, you know, and they said, oh, it's just like, you know, corporate greed or whatever. Which, I mean, come on. They run a for-profit business, right? What do you expect them to do? Not make money? That's the first thing. But I will commend the council for not caving into the local citizenry and really just saying, we got to look at the law and we got to rule according to the law. And, you know, because a lot of times these councils don't do that. They just ignore the law and they just wait for a lawsuit. Well, in this case, you know, council members were called cowards and all sorts of other names by the local Ramsey folks. But I'm like, you know, they aren't cowards. They're actually courageous because they did what the law said. Even if you don't like Love's, right? And let's say you were like, oh, we won't let Love's come in because we think there's going to be trucks around. And by the way, this is Montana. There's trucks everywhere, right? I mean, mining trucks, ranch truck, you know, it's like, it's this little tiny town that says they're going to be adversely impacted. But, you know, even if you don't like Love's, right? You gotta at least, you still got to obey the law, because if you don't, the law means nothing, right? If you only hook up your friends, then you have no integrity. So let's talk about another guy. Oh, real quick, I'm going to talk about a guy that had integrity, but a historical figure. But the other thing I wanted to mention is AB5. Remember I told you there was a trucker protest in Long Beach and Los Angeles, and then the one in Oakland was going to start this past Monday. Well, in Oakland, apparently the guy with the spokesman for the ports was like, that was nothing. And he probably grossly underestimated how many people came out Monday. So then the truckers were like, okay, we'll show you. And then they protested with even more people Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday, then Friday. Now, the ILWU, the International Longshore Workers Union, initially refused to cross the line. It wasn't really a picket line, but they wouldn't cross because they have this health and safety carve-out in their contract. However, it's not really a picket line, and these truckers are not union, so the longshoremen are gonna, you know, go to work. It's kind of weird, but the truckers are thinking that they're gonna get an exemption, and maybe they will, I don't know. You know, they're gonna get a carve-out, and like I mentioned before with AB5, there's so many constituencies that got carve-outs that truckers didn't. So anyway, we'll see about that. So anyway, let's talk about history. Or, well, we talked about it already a little bit with Euclid, but take a look at this. Okay, so I'm here at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. This is here in Mentor, Ohio. I'm going to spin around here, and we're going to talk about some of the things at this really cool property. Talk about the president. This is his home in the background there. A lot of what you see, though, was actually added after his death. Garfield was our 20th president, and he was shot in the railway station in Washington, D.C. on July 2nd, 1881. He survived until September 19th. He was a big, strong guy, and for a long time they thought he was going to survive the gunshot, but they were never able to find the bullet. And Alexander Graham Bell actually had like an early version of the X-ray that he brought to the White House, because Garfield was shot. He then he's taken back to the White House, and he's trying to convalesce, and doctors are attending to him. In September, he goes out to New Jersey, which actually was where he was headed when he was shot in the train station. He heads out to New Jersey, and he passes away there on September 19th, even though he seemed to be doing better. But he ultimately died of an infection. And it was very sad. He was only president for 200 days, because back then they didn't have the inauguration until March 4th. It wasn't moved to January 20th until years after Garfield was president. But we'll take a look at some other stuff that is here. So what you see in front of you has got to be the coolest windmill I've ever seen. And this windmill was actually built after Garfield's death by his wife. This property that I'm on is only 8 acres, but it originally was a pretty big farm, well over 100 acres. And let's pan around here. So the building you see in the foreground, which is a little hard to see, but it's right there. Sorry about my finger. That's a campaign office, and I'll throw up a picture of that. And as I kind of move around here, you can see the campaign office along with the back of the house. Now, when Garfield was alive, the house wasn't as big as it is. His wife, Lucretia, put an addition on it, which really was, for all intents and purposes, the first presidential library. And I'll show you a picture of that here in a second. And so this is a better view of the back of the house, I think. But you see there's a carriage stop there. This road in the foreground is actually a dirt road that was here when Garfield was alive. And getting back to the presidential library, so his wife was so dedicated to keeping his memory alive and also preserving all of his papers that she built in the as in like a little room adjacent to the library, she built this like flame-proof safe for all of his papers. Here's a picture of that. So as we come back, you can see there's the base of the windmill over there through the trees. And then as I pan around, this building in front of us is actually the visitor center here, but this was built by Garfield's wife, and this was a carriage house. And it also had stables on the bottom floor, and on the top floor, some of the workers who lived here at the farm, the caretakers for the for the horses, and you know, maybe a guy that was a farrier or something along those lines. And as I pan over here to the right a little bit and we'll walk towards it, this was a house that she had built for the farm, basically the farm manager. So she had a tenant farmer here. And like I said, this property was pretty sizable. All the area that's straight back was all Garfield's property. And anyway, so there was this tenant farmer that took care of it. The Garfields at the time of James Garfield's assassination had 5 children that were living. They had 7. 2 of them didn't make it to adulthood. But he had a relatively young family. When he died, he was only 49 years old. So it was, this was a big piece of land, and it was a place where the family lived. They couldn't and didn't want to just up and leave. This is their family house. Not this one you're looking at, but this was their family property. And so, you know, she worked this farm and made it work, and I'll talk about in a minute about some help that she got. So these are some other outbuildings that were on the farm here. A bas-relief of President Garfield. I like this quote here. It says, "How sweet and inviting the dear home beckons me away among the green fields of Mentor." And that was from a letter that James Garfield wrote to his wife in May of 1877. And Garfield was a congressman when he was elected to the presidency. And here's the back of the carriage house, which now serves as the visitor center.
Speeches for each man who had Garfield such notoriety that the Republican Party of the Reserve asked him to run for state senate, which he proudly claimed a product of the party.
So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. So I just did a series of pictures of different things inside the house, but I wanted to point out a couple of pictures. So there was the one of a stained glass. That stained glass was actually made after Garfield was assassinated, but it was used, it's original, and it was made in the 1880s, but it was used as a fireplace, what do you call it? I can't remember the term, but basically like it sat in front of a fireplace, so the flames would have illuminated it. I thought that was really cool. You also saw a picture inside the vault that I had mentioned earlier. There's a wreath that you see a picture of. That wreath was sent to Lucretia Garfield by Queen Victoria for the funeral, although I think it arrived, I don't know if it arrived right away. It would have still taken a few days to get across the Atlantic, but that wreath was sent, maybe, well, actually, now that I think of it, maybe she just, sent a message to the embassy and they put it together. But anyway, it came from Queen Victoria, and it is actually was after the funeral. It was kept by Lucretia Garfield, and it was waxed. So that's how it's been preserved this whole time. And also, I showed you kind of like the inside of the vault there. The other thing, there's a portrait of James A. Garfield. His middle name was Abram, by the way, in a Civil War uniform. And before he was before he was the president, he was the president of Hiram College, which is where I'm picking my load up tomorrow, in Hiram, Ohio. And then he served in the Civil War. However, he was he was, Lincoln was in need of political allies, and Garfield actually thought Lincoln was not prosecuting the war fast enough. So Lincoln asked Garfield to step out of uniform and go back into Congress as a Republican ally. And Garfield was one of the radical Republicans. So think Thaddeus Stevens, War Secretary Edwin Stanton, Salmon Chase, who was, I believe, the Secretary of Treasury during the Lincoln administration. Those guys were hardliners and really wanted to put a whooping on the South for secession. And so Garfield went back into Congress, and of course, later on, after he'd served many terms in Congress, he's nominated for the Republican nomination for president on the 32nd ballot. He had originally gone to the convention in Chicago to support a guy named John Sherman. John Sherman is the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the general who, burnt Georgia to the ground, basically, and a Union general. And Tecumseh Sherman and John Sherman were friends with Garfield. They were also Ohioans, and so they knew Garfield pretty well. And but what happened is, Garfield had gone to the convention because back then nominees didn't normally go. The potential nominees didn't normally go. So Garfield goes as a delegate from Ohio to the convention in Chicago. This is the 1880 Republican convention. It's held in Chicago. Garfield goes, and he's the principal speaker for the nomination of John Sherman. But the convention was brokered. It wasn't a fait accompli like it is most of the time now. So after 32 ballots, Garfield comes up and he has enough votes, enough delegates to be the nominee. So go figure. And then that campaign office I showed you, he really did campaign from his home. Surrogates were the ones that went out for the candidates back then. And Garfield ran what was called a front porch campaign. And almost on a daily basis, people, because the road in front of his house is US 20, but that was the main road from Buffalo to Cleveland. So people would just stop at his house, knock on his door, and be like, hey, can we meet this guy? And, he'd wait till a few people were hanging around, and then he'd go out there and give them a speech. And then he'd go back in the house. And that's how he was basically running for president. Because, truthfully, even though he was trained as a lawyer and he was, a college professor, he ran a farm. That's really kind of how he made his money. And so he was busy. He was home for recess or whatever. And so, somebody would go tell him, hey, James or whatever they called him, Jim, Dad, there's 20 people in the front yard want to see you. And he'd stop what he was doing, go out there and give them a speech. And next thing you know, he's elected. So, and I don't have time to get into all the reasons he was murdered, but his murder, and he really was against patronage. And he outmaneuvered political rivals to get rid of patronage. But one of the things that came out of his assassination was a revision called the Flaherty Laws that revised how the civil service was run and made it more on merit and less on who you knew. And that was important because it gave the system integrity. He recognized that it was a bad plan. And like I said, he outmaneuvered political rivals to avoid patronage, but it was still probably because of patronage is part of the reason he was assassinated by the guy that killed him, who was a lawyer, actually. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time on Tim Travels.